The lake looked like a promise from far away. A sheet of steel-gray water cupped in the arms of pines and ridgelines, the surface quiet enough to reflect the sky like a held breath. The kind of view people paid extra for in glossy brochures, peaceful, clean, untouched by the world's noise. Officer Ethan Cole didn't trust promises, not because he was cynical, because he had learned, slowly, painfully, that anything that looked too calm could be hiding something underneath. His truck rolled down the last stretch of dirt road, tires crunching over gravel that had been packed and repacked by winters that didn't negotiate. The air had that late autumn bite, sharp enough to sting his nostrils, cold enough to turn every exhale into pale smoke that vanished too fast. Pines leaned into the wind like they'd been doing it for 100 years. Shadow rode behind the partition in the back seat, still as a carved figure, eyes tracking the shifting trees with the same patience he'd brought to every perimeter check they'd ever done together. Retired didn't change the way a working dog watched a world. Ethan slowed near a mailbox that looked like it had survived 3 wars and a handful of bored teenagers. The faded numbers matched the paperwork Captain Maria Hayes had texted him earlier. "You sure about this place?" He hadn't answered then, not because he didn't hear her, because he didn't have an answer that fit. This was supposed to be simple, a quiet transfer, a clean break, a place where the nights didn't smell like heat and metal and burnt wiring, a place where Shadow could run without hearing rotors overhead or distant pops that made his ears flick and his body assemble itself without permission, a place where Ethan could sleep without waking up. Ready to fight. The house appeared through the trees at the end of the drive, 2 stories, wide windows facing the lake, a deck that looked like it had been built for coffee mugs and sunrise. Modest, not grand. Enough land to feel alone, but not so far from town that he'd have to disappear completely. He parked and killed the engine. For a moment, the silence settled around them. Then Shadow huffed once from the back seat, low, controlled, not excited, not relaxed either. Ethan opened the door and cold air rushed in like a hand checking his temperature. He crossed to the rear, released the latch. Shadow stepped out with purpose, not a trot, not a bounce, a measured walk, paws placing themselves like each step mattered. His head lifted, nose pulling in the world, pine sap, wet earth, lake water. Then his ears flicked left, right, and locked for a second toward the house. Ethan watched him. Shadow didn't look afraid, he looked alert. Ethan's phone buzzed again. Maria. He ignored it and pocketed the device. He wasn't on duty anymore. That was what he kept telling himself. He didn't have to answer to anyone's worry or anyone's plan. He could choose a quiet life. He could let the world keep its secrets. Except Shadow's body didn't agree with that fantasy. The dog moved toward the house without looking back. Ethan followed, keys heavy in his palm. The front door opened with the reluctant groan of wood that hadn't been used in a while. Inside smelled like dust, stale paper, and cold. Not rot, not mold, just abandonment. He stepped in. Shadow entered behind him and stopped immediately in the foyer, head angled, eyes scanning corners. Ethan set his bag down and did what his body always did, mapped the space. Windows, sight lines, entry points, dead angles. He hated that he still did it. Hated that peace wasn't natural to him anymore. But he'd learned to accept the truth about himself. Certain habits didn't fade just because you wanted them to. Shadow moved deeper, nails clicking softly against hardwood. Ethan watched him drift through rooms like he was reading the building, not exploring it. The living room was open and bright, even with the pale sky outside. A big bookshelf sat near the window, built in, old wood polished by time. A stone fireplace, a kitchen behind it, with an island. Nothing screamed danger. And yet, Shadow stopped at the bookshelf, his ears sharpened forward, tail still. He sniffed once, twice, then he pawed, not casually, not playfully, with precision, with insistence. Ethan frowned. Shadow? The dog didn't look at him, didn't break focus. He pawed again. Nails scraped wood, a quiet, urgent sound. Then Shadow let out a low whine, soft but charged, like a warning that hadn't decided whether to become a bark. Ethan's chest tightened. Shadow didn't whine, not like that, not unless something was wrong. Ethan stepped closer and crouched beside him. He ran his hand along the shelf, feeling the grain, the coolness of the wood. Then his fingers found it. A seam that wasn't supposed to be there, a slight difference in temperature, like air was moving behind it. He pressed. The panel resisted. Shadow pawed again, harder. Ethan shifted his grip and pushed with the heel of his hand. Click. The sound was small, but it changed the room. The panel loosened. Ethan pulled it outward. A narrow compartment opened like a mouth. Inside were stacks of envelopes, folders, a leather-bound journal with worn corners, paper arranged in a way that wasn't random hiding. It was organized storage. Shadow exhaled sharply and backed half a step, eyes locked on the opening like he was waiting for whatever lived in there to crawl out. Ethan didn't move for a moment. Not because he was scared, because his instincts were already doing math. Someone hid this. Someone hid it carefully. Someone expected it to be found. And someone did not want it found. Ethan reached in and lifted the journal. The leather was dry, edges cracked. It felt heavier than it should. He opened it. The handwriting was neat, slanted, controlled. A name appeared on the inside cover. Not Ethan's, not the seller's, someone else's. A missing man, if the town whispers were right. Ethan flipped a few pages. The words weren't fiction, not rambling. They were notes, dates, meetings, names beside numbers, references to inspection passes that didn't match the reports, mentions of contamination points marked on hand-drawn maps, bribes, threats, and then written with a pressure that felt like panic even on paper. If anything happens to me, the truth is in this house. Ethan's jaw tightened. Shadow's head snapped toward the front window. A low growl rolled from his chest, deep, warning, controlled. Ethan's eyes lifted from the journal. The window showed only the pale yard and the trees beyond. But Shadow wasn't guessing. Shadow was reacting. Ethan closed the journal slowly and slid it back into the compartment with the folders. He didn't lock the panel yet. He just held it in place with his hand, listening. The house was silent. But the silence felt different now, not empty, watchful. Shadow stood pressed to Ethan's leg, fur slightly raised along his spine. Ethan didn't have to ask what the dog was saying. He already knew. This place wasn't just cheap. It was dangerous. And they had arrived right on time. Ethan didn't call the local police. That decision came as naturally as breathing. Not because he thought every cop in every town was corrupt, but because he'd seen what corruption looked like when it wore a uniform. He'd watched good people disappear under paperwork and polite explanations. He'd watched bad people climb by, hiding behind procedure, and he'd read enough in those pages to understand one thing. Whoever buried this truth had done it because they could. He guided Shadow into the kitchen and poured water into a bowl, then pretended to unpack, kept his movements normal, kept the blinds half open, kept the house looking like a man settling in, not a man finding a landmine under the floorboards. But his mind was already in another mode, operational. He made coffee he didn't need. He opened cabinets he didn't care about. He checked locks, windows, the back door, quietly. Shadow stayed close. Not clingy, just anchored. Every now and then the dog's ears would flick toward the yard, then settle again, like he was tracking something on a frequency Ethan couldn't hear. Ethan's phone buzzed again. Maria. This time he answered. Yeah? Her sigh came through the speaker like she'd been holding it. You alive? Still. You didn't text back. That usually means your instincts are screaming. Ethan stared at the living room where the bookshelf sat like a normal object, pretending it wasn't. My instincts don't scream, he said. Maria snorted softly. They whisper. And you listen like it's gospel. What's going on? He didn't want to bring her into it, didn't want to drag anyone into a mess that was supposed to be behind him. But Maria wasn't just a supervisor. She was the kind of leader who didn't let her people carry weights alone. Even now, with retirement papers signed and duty officially over, she still acted like Ethan was hers to protect. He lowered his voice. Shadow found something. What kind of something? Evidence, Ethan said. Hidden, organized. A pause. The kind Maria used when she was switching from friend to captain. Evidence of what? Ethan looked down at Shadow, who was watching him with steady amber eyes. Bribery, contamination, a journalist's notes. Whoever owned this place before didn't just leave. Maria's voice flattened. You sure it's real? I've read enough to know it's not someone's hobby. Another pause. Then, where are you? Silverpine, lakeside. You're kidding? No. Maria exhaled, slower this time. Ethan, Silverpine has had rumors for years. Environmental complaints, missing person talk that never stays quiet. And that lake feeds into half the county's water. Ethan said nothing. The wind outside brushed the window like fingers. Maria continued, careful. Do not, hear me, do not take this to local channels. If this is what you think it is, you don't know who's tied to it. I'm aware. Then you need to think like you used to. Redundancy, security, distribution. Ethan's gaze drifted to the hidden panel again. Distribution, making truth too big to bury. He nodded once, even though she couldn't see him. I'll loop in Lena. Good, Maria said, and Lucas is with me. He can help if you need a second set of hands, someone fast but not reckless. Ethan almost laughed. Lucas is fast and reckless. He's fast, Maria corrected, and learning. Don't do this alone. Ethan ended the call without promising anything. He didn't like being told what to do. But Maria was right. He couldn't fight a system by himself in a cabin with a dog, no matter how good the dog was. He needed strategy, not bravado. He moved back to the bookshelf and opened the panel again. This time, he didn't just look. He cataloged. Folders labeled with dates, copies of emails, lists of names with amounts beside them, maps with marked runoff points near streams, notations that suggested the evidence had been gathered methodically, like an investigation building a case. And in the journal, the final entries weren't just fearful. They were specific. I saw the SUV again. Phone line clicked. Inspection report falsified. Confirmed. They said I can still walk away. The last line was the one that made Ethan's stomach harden. They told me my house wouldn't protect me. Ethan closed the journal and ran his thumb along the spine. He didn't know the missing journalist, didn't know what kind of man he was beyond what was in these pages. But Ethan knew what it meant to be hunted, and he knew the difference between paranoia and pattern recognition. Shadow's growl returned, softer than before. Ethan turned. Shadow was staring toward the back door now, head low, ears forward. His body wasn't in attack mode, it was in warning mode. Ethan approached the back window carefully and looked out. The yard sloped down toward the lake, dotted with frost-kissed grass and pine needles. The tree line beyond was thick and dark. Nothing moved, and yet Shadow didn't relax. Ethan felt it then, like a shift in air pressure. The sense of being observed, not imaginary, not mystical, just real. He backed away from the window and knelt beside Shadow, hand resting on the dog's neck. He felt the muscle coiled under fur, felt the steady breath. We're not leaving, Ethan murmured. Shadow didn't bark. He just stayed pressed close, like he understood the promise. Ethan stood and pulled his laptop from his bag. If the enemy was watching, then time mattered. If the enemy wanted the paper evidence, then the answer was simple. Make it not just paper anymore. He connected to a secure hotspot, opened a scanning app, and began photographing each page carefully, slow enough to avoid mistakes, fast enough to beat whoever might be driving up the dirt road with a clean coat and a polite smile. He compiled files into an encrypted folder, and then he paused over the recipients list. Maria had said Lena. Dr. Lena Moore wasn't just smart. She was relentless in a quiet way, brilliant at pattern recognition, evidence triage, and identifying what would survive scrutiny when the noise started. Ethan sent her a short message with an encrypted link. Found something hidden, need triage, high risk. Do not forward without my confirmation. Then he sent Maria a note. I'm scanning now. Shadow alerted to possible surveillance. Keep Lucas ready but quiet. He didn't send anything else yet, not until he knew what the most explosive pieces were, not until he had a plan. Outside, the wind shifted. Shadow's ears flicked. Ethan kept scanning, because in his gut he could already feel what was coming next. Pressure. Then a threat. Then, if he didn't comply, retrieval. The first rule Ethan had learned in the teams wasn't about weapons or tactics, it was about tempo. Whoever controlled the tempo controlled the fight. You could be outnumbered, outgunned, outfunded, and still win if you forced the other side to move on your timing instead of theirs. Right now, Ethan didn't control anything. He was reacting to a house that had decided to speak, to a dog that had decided to warn, and to a truth that had been waiting in darkness long enough to grow teeth. He kept scanning until his eyes felt gritty, stopping only long enough to photograph the journal pages in order. He didn't read every line. He skimmed for structure, dates, names, patterns, anything that connected money to decisions, decisions to damage, damage to cover-up. Shadow lay at Ethan's feet, facing the back door, not sleeping, not resting, guarding. Every time a floorboard popped under Ethan's shifting weight, Shadow's ears flicked. Every time the wind hit the siding, Shadow's nose lifted and tested the air. Ethan finished the last folder and encrypted the package again with a second layer, the kind of redundancy Maria had drilled into him back when his life lived on radios and code words. He attached a file index and sent it to Lena. Then he waited, eyes on the window, hand unconsciously near the pocket where he'd placed the small broken transmitter piece he'd found outside earlier, a coin-sized shard of matte black casing that didn't belong to any hiker or curious teen. A reply came within minutes. Lena, received. Opening in an isolated environment. First impression. This is real. If the money trail is accurate, it implicates county-level oversight and private enforcement. Give me 20 minutes. Ethan stared at the message. Private enforcement. That fit the intrusion team profile he'd imagined without wanting to. He wasn't dealing with random thugs. He was dealing with a machine. His phone buzzed again, this time with Maria's name. Ethan answered without hesitation. Yeah? Maria's voice was low, controlled. Lucas is pulling open source on Silverpine. Property records, prior police calls, anything public. He's finding gaps. Gaps? Places where reports should exist and don't, Maria said. Or exist but are thin, like someone scraped the edges. Ethan's jaw tightened. Meaning local control. Meaning someone has been managing the narrative, she corrected. Ethan, where are your neighbors? Anyone near you? Closest house is across a dirt path, Ethan said. Older guy came by earlier yesterday. Friendly, nervous. Don't trust friendly, Maria replied immediately. Not yet. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't need to. Maria went on. What's your immediate plan? Ethan looked at Shadow. The dog's eyes were open, tracking the space behind Ethan's shoulder like he could see through drywall. My immediate plan is to make sure this evidence survives me, Ethan said. Good, Maria said. But survival includes you, Ethan. You can't distribute truth if you're dead. There it was, the blunt line Maria always used when she needed him to stop thinking like a martyr and start thinking like a strategist. Ethan glanced out the front window again. The yard sat still under the pale sky. But stillness didn't mean safety. In fact, in Ethan's experience, the worst moment was always the quiet right before movement. I'm setting up perimeter awareness, Ethan said. Minimal, no obvious signs. Do it, Maria said. And listen, if anyone shows up with pressure tactics, money, threats, do not engage emotionally. Keep them talking if you can. Every word reveals their goal. Ethan almost smiled. Maria turned everything into an investigation, even fear. I'll keep it clean, he said. Maria paused. And Ethan? Yeah. If this goes hot, Lucas and I can be there. Ethan's voice stayed calm. That's why I didn't pick a place near Denver. Maria snorted softly again. You always were stubborn. He hung up. Stubborn wasn't the word. He was tired, but tired didn't mean weak. Ethan moved quietly through the house and began preparing in a way that didn't look like preparation if someone peeked through the windows. He didn't nail boards. He didn't string traps like a movie. He did simple things. Move furniture to create staggered lines of movement, checked that every door latch was functional, placed his tactical lamps where they could light corners without turning the whole house into a beacon. He tested the back door's frame, solid but old. Old wood could break. Old locks could be picked. He took a small wedge from his kit and set it near the base, something that could turn a forced entry from a clean breach into a loud struggle. Loud buys time. Time buys options. Shadow followed him, silent. When Ethan stopped, Shadow stopped. When Ethan turned, Shadow turned. A synchronized unit even after retirement. The bond between them wasn't affection alone. It was a shared language built under stress, a trust forged by nights where survival depended on noticing what nobody else noticed. Ethan had just finished setting a low-profile camera by the back window, one he'd used in overseas safe houses, when headlights swept across the yard. His body went still. Shadow's ears snapped forward. A low growl built, then died into silence. Ethan moved to the front window and looked out through the sliver of gap between curtain and frame. A dark SUV sat at the edge of the drive, not a local pickup, not mud-caked. This one looked clean even from here. The driver's side door opened slowly. A man stepped out, tall, posture straight despite the cold. He wore a long coat that didn't belong in mountain work. His boots looked expensive. Shadow's growl returned, deeper now, vibrating in the floorboards. Ethan didn't reach for a gun, not because he didn't want to, because he didn't have to. A gun would make the situation simple, too simple, and simple was dangerous. He opened the door before the man could knock. The cold air slapped his face. The man on the porch smiled like they were old friends. "Officer Cole," he said, voice smooth. "I hope I'm not intruding." Ethan didn't answer the greeting. He studied him instead. Mid-50s, silver hair slicked back, eyes pale, sharp, unreadable, hands bare despite the cold, either arrogance or confidence. The man glanced down briefly at Shadow, who stood behind Ethan's legs, head low, eyes locked, silent. The man's smile tightened a fraction. "Beautiful dog." Ethan's voice stayed neutral. "What do you want?" The man lifted his hands slightly, palms open. "Richard Hale. I represent parties with interests in this property." Ethan didn't move. "The property is mine." "Of course," Hale said, "and I respect that, truly." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper like he'd rehearsed the gesture in a mirror. "But there's been a misunderstanding. This house should not have been sold." Ethan took the paper without offering thanks. It was an offer letter, a number printed at the bottom that made even Ethan blink once. 10 times what he'd paid, more than enough to buy another house, another slice of quiet. Hale watched Ethan's face, looking for cracks. Ethan gave him none. "Not interested," Ethan said, and handed the paper back. Hale's smile remained, but it wasn't a smile anymore. It was a cover. "Officer Cole," Hale said softly, "I understand you're looking for peace. I admire that. But peace isn't always compatible with certain locations." Ethan held his gaze. "Sounds like you're threatening me." Hale chuckled as if Ethan had made a joke. "Threatening? No. Advising." His eyes flicked toward the lake, then back. "This town has a way of swallowing people who poke at old stories." Shadow took a single step forward. Not lunging, not barking, just stepping into visibility. Hale's gaze dropped to the dog again and lingered longer than before, as if measuring the animal's capacity. "Keep your dog close," Hale said, voice still smooth. "Some places aren't safe for animals." Ethan's calm hardened. "You're done here." Hale's jaw tightened slightly. The mask slipped, just enough to show what lived underneath. Calculation, impatience, entitlement. He nodded once. "Think about it. You're a smart man. Smart men don't die for strangers." Then he turned and walked back to the SUV. Headlights swept the yard again as the vehicle backed out and disappeared down the road. Ethan stood in the doorway longer than he needed to, not frozen, listening. Shadow remained at his side, body angled toward where the SUV had vanished. Ethan closed the door and locked it. Then he moved fast. He returned to the bookshelf, opened the hidden panel, and removed the journal and folders. If someone was bold enough to show up in daylight with money and veiled threats, then they already knew. They knew the house had been compromised. They knew the evidence was at risk. And if they were willing to pay, they were willing to take. Ethan carried the documents to the kitchen table and laid them out in organized stacks. Then he checked his phone. A new message from Lena. "Lena, this is a bomb. The maps plus inspection logs plus payment ledgers tie contamination sites to falsified reports. Names recur, county inspectors, a state-level director, and a private security contractor. Whoever Hale is, he's likely the negotiator. Muscle comes after negotiation fails. You need to distribute now, but do it smart. Stagger recipients, include a dead man note that more exists." Ethan read it twice. Then he looked at Shadow. "Muscle comes after negotiation fails," he murmured. Shadow's ears flicked as if he understood the word muscle. Ethan didn't have the luxury of waiting for nightfall. But distributing in daylight could also trigger immediate escalation. He needed a window, a short window. He sent Maria a message. Hale visited, offered buyback. Implied threats. Maria responded almost instantly. "Then they're in motion. Lucas is ready. Keep Shadow close. Distribute now." Ethan did. He built 3 separate encrypted packages. One went to Maria so leadership could coordinate. One went to Lena for analysis and priority extraction. One went wider, to to 3 national investigative desks, a federal environmental watchdog contact Lena provided, and a journalist mailbox Maria trusted. He staggered the send times by minutes, not hours. Redundancy without predictability. Then he wrote a short plain text message in each email. If you're reading this, someone is trying to bury these documents. Publish fast. Mirror them. Assume surveillance. He hit send. Each time his finger hovered for a fraction before committing, as if he could feel the invisible line being crossed. When the last message left his outbox, he exhaled through his nose. Shadow moved closer and pressed his shoulder against Ethan's thigh. Steady pressure, grounding. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's neck. "Good," he murmured. "Now they can't take it back." Outside, the wind picked up. The lake surface shifted, ripples tightening like a warning. Ethan began putting the physical documents back into the compartment, but not all of them. He kept the journal out. He needed it close. Because something told him the worst part wasn't the evidence. It was the story behind it, and the people who had silenced the man who wrote it. The storm arrived like an ambush. It didn't roll in slowly, polite, with distant thunder. It slammed into Silverpine with sudden wind that rattled the window frames and drove rain sideways, turning the yard into a blur of motion. Pines swayed, branches scraping against each other like bones. Ethan stood at the kitchen sink watching the first sheets of water hit the deck. Shadow stood beside him, body stiff. The dog didn't like storms, not because of noise, but because storms covered sounds. Storms gave predators cover. Lightning cracked across the sky, bright enough to turn the lake white for a split second. A second later, thunder hit, deep and heavy, shaking the house. Then the lights flickered once, twice, and went out. Darkness filled the rooms instantly, thickened by the storm and the clouded windows. The only light came from pale flashes outside and the faint glow of Ethan's phone screen. Ethan didn't panic. His hands moved automatically, like this was familiar terrain. He retrieved 2 small tactical lamps from his kit and turned them on low, placing them where they created soft illumination without painting the windows. Shadow watched him, then moved to the back door. Ethan checked the locks again. He felt the house settle under the pressure of wind, every creak amplified by silence that wasn't really silence, just rain hammering the roof hard enough to drown out anything else. He took position in the kitchen, where he could see both the back entry and the hallway. Shadow stayed slightly forward, near the door, but not in the open. A living sensor. Minutes passed, long enough for Ethan to wonder if the storm itself was the only enemy tonight. Then Shadow's head snapped up, his ears pinned forward. A low, rumbling growl rose from his chest. Ethan's body tightened. He listened. At first he heard only the storm. Then, faint beneath it, something else. A soft tap. 3 knocks on the back door, evenly spaced. Not wind, not a branch. Knuckles. Ethan lowered his profile behind the kitchen counter, controlling his breathing. Shadow crouched, muscles coiled. Another sound, subtle scraping near the back window, metal against wood, someone testing. Then, from the side of the house, a second set of footsteps, fast and coordinated, not the stumbling of a drunk or a curious neighbor. Ethan's mind clicked into certainty. A team. He didn't move toward the door. That's what they wanted. He stayed where he could force them into a funnel. The scraping intensified. A low metallic click. Lockpicking. The wedge he'd placed would help, but only if the frame held long enough. Ethan's hand tightened around the flashlight, not as a light source, but as a weapon if needed. Shadow's growl deepened, vibrating through the floor. The back door handle turned, paused, turned again. Then weight hit the door. Once, twice. The wedge held for a moment, then the old frame gave. The door burst inward with a crack of splintering wood, wind and rain blasting into the kitchen like a cold slap. 3 figures rushed inside, dark waterproof jackets, tactical gloves, faces covered, not amateurs. The first man carried a baton and a flashlight. The second had something shaped like a stun device. The third moved low and fast, knife glinting briefly when lightning flashed outside. Ethan waited a heartbeat. Let them commit. Then he moved. He struck the first intruder at the wrist, twisting hard, forcing the baton to fall. An elbow drove into ribs. The man folded with a grunt. Shadow launched the moment Ethan created space, teeth clamping onto the second man's forearm with brutal precision. The stun device clattered to the floor as the intruder screamed, staggering backward. The third man slashed toward Ethan's torso. Ethan sidestepped, kicked the attacker's knee sharply, and drove him into the hallway wall. The fight wasn't loud compared to the storm. It was tight, violent, efficient. A flash of lightning illuminated the room in stark blue, revealing wet boot prints on the floor and the sheen of rainwater dripping from masks. Then a fourth figure appeared in the doorway. Taller, broader, wearing a tactical vest. Even masked, his posture screamed leadership. His voice cut through the chaos. "Find the files," he barked. "We leave with the evidence." So it was exactly what Lena predicted. Retrieval. The leader stepped forward, knife in hand, scanning quickly, kitchen, living room, bookshelf. Shadow snarled viciously and shifted, keeping himself between the leader and Ethan. The leader swung his flashlight toward Shadow like he meant to blind him. Ethan intercepted, grabbing the leader's arm, pulling him off balance. The leader fought back with heavy strength, elbowing Ethan in the ribs, breaking the grip. Ethan absorbed the blow without collapsing. Pain was familiar. He'd lived with it. The leader slashed with his knife. Ethan ducked, feeling air move inches from his face. Shadow leapt for the leader's leg. The leader kicked, catching Shadow's shoulder enough to knock him sideways. Not enough to injure, just enough to buy space. Shadow hit the floor, rolled, and was back up instantly, eyes blazing. One of the intruders, recovering, shouted, "The journal, where is it?" Ethan's blood went cold. They knew exactly what they wanted, meaning Hale wasn't guessing. Hale had intel. Ethan drove the third intruder back into the living room, crashing him into the bookshelf. A stack of decorative items toppled, scattering across the floor. Thunder boomed overhead. The leader pointed the knife toward Ethan. "You don't know what you're involved in," he snarled. "Walk away. Maybe you keep that dog alive." The threat snapped something in Ethan. Not rage. Focus. Cold, precise focus. He shifted his stance. "You picked the wrong house," Ethan said. And then he attacked first. He closed distance fast, forcing the leader into close quarters, where the knife couldn't arc wide. He trapped the leader's wrist, slammed it against the wall, and felt bone or joint protest. The knife dropped. Shadow seized the moment and clamped onto the leader's calf with a deep, committed bite. The leader roared and stumbled. Ethan struck once, clean, controlled. The leader dropped unconscious. The remaining intruders hesitated. In that hesitation, they made the only choice left. They ran. They spilled back into the storm, disappearing into rain and darkness like they'd never existed. Ethan moved to the door and slammed it shut, shoving the wedge back into place. He locked it. Then he stood in the dark, chest rising and falling, listening to the storm and the fading footfalls outside. Shadow pressed against his leg, panting hard but steady. Ethan ran his hands over the dog quickly, shoulders, ribs, legs, checking for injury. Shadow was damp, breathing fast, but intact. Ethan exhaled, the tightness in his chest loosening just enough to allow air. The house was wrecked. Furniture shifted, papers scattered. But the evidence? Still here. And now the enemy had shown their face, masked but unmistakable. Ethan looked down at Shadow and whispered, "We're not done." Shadow didn't bark. He just stared toward the back door, ears high, ready. Morning came, washed clean, like the storm had tried to scrub the world of what happened in the dark. The lake looked calmer, almost innocent, mist lifting off the surface in thin ribbons that drifted toward the tree line. Sunlight hit wet pine needles and made them shine. Birds returned to the branches as if violence had never crossed the threshold of the house. Inside, the house told the truth. Splintered wood at the back door. A chair knocked over near the hallway. A smear of mud on the hardwood where one of the intruders had skidded. A few small drops of blood. Someone's forearm where Shadow had bitten down and refused to let go. Ethan stood in the kitchen with a mug of black coffee he hadn't really tasted, staring at the wreckage like it was a map. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't proud. He was confirming. Last night had been proof. Not just that the threat was real, he'd known that the moment Shadow scratched at the wall. Proof that the enemy had a mission, a chain of command, and confidence. Confidence came from protection. Protection came from influence. Influence came from a system that believed it couldn't be challenged by one man and his dog. Ethan glanced down. Shadow sat near the back door, watching the gap beneath it, as if an army might crawl through the crack. His ears moved in small adjustments, tracking sounds outside that Ethan couldn't separate from wind and distant water. Ethan crouched beside him and ran a hand down his neck. "You did your job," Ethan murmured. "Now I do mine." Shadow's eyes softened for half a second, then sharpened again. Ethan rose and moved with purpose, not haste. Haste made mistakes. He retrieved the journal from where he'd kept it close during the night and opened it again. This time he read the last entries slowly, letting the pattern settle. The missing journalist hadn't vanished because of a random accident. He'd been hunted. He'd tried to leave a trail. He'd trusted that someone with a backbone would eventually find it. Ethan looked around the kitchen. He could almost feel the shape of the story, how it might have ended for the man who wrote these words. A knock at the door, a polite offer, a warning. And then the quiet removal of a problem. Ethan's gaze hardened. They'd tried that sequence on him. Offer, warning, retrieval. They'd stopped at retrieval because Ethan and Shadow didn't break, but next time wouldn't be a test. Next time would be an end. Ethan's phone buzzed. "Maria." He answered. "You okay?" Her voice came through sharp, controlled, with that edge she got when she'd already made peace with the worst and still kept moving anyway. "I'm standing," Ethan said. "Shadow?" "Fine," Maria exhaled. "Lucas heard commotion on your line last night, then nothing. We were ready to move." Ethan didn't apologize. "Storm drowned everything." "Tell me what happened," Maria said. Ethan gave her the facts, clean and precise. Entry point, number of attackers, their words, their priority, journal, proof. Maria stayed silent until he finished. Then she said, "That confirms it. They're operating like contractors." Lena said the same. "Lena is already building an evidence chain," Maria replied. "She's identifying which documents will stand up in court, which names connect to which regulatory decisions, and which pieces matter most to federal agencies." Ethan's jaw tightened. Federal agencies. Maria heard what he wasn't saying. "You think locals are compromised?" "I don't think," Ethan said. "I know the kind of confidence those men had. They weren't worried about consequences." Maria paused, then said, "You distributed last night. Good, but we need redundancy beyond email. Mirrors, external storage, multiple jurisdictions." Ethan looked at his laptop sitting open on the kitchen table like a quiet weapon. "I'm doing it now." "You need to move the physical documents," Maria said. "If they come again and burn the place, those papers die. And even with digital copies, original documents carry weight." Ethan glanced toward the hidden compartment. The house had held those papers for years. It had kept them safe until Shadow found them. Now the house was a target. "I'm not leaving them here," Ethan said. Maria's voice softened slightly, but only slightly. "And Ethan, Lucas is on his way." Ethan almost objected. Then he remembered the way the intruders moved, the way the leader had said, "We'd leave with the evidence." If a second wave came, Ethan couldn't afford to do everything alone while also defending the perimeter. He needed a second set of hands. "Okay," Ethan said. "Tell him to come quiet." Maria didn't sound relieved. She sounded focused. "He's already quiet. He's learning." Ethan ended the call and turned to his laptop. He created a second mirror set, encrypted archives uploaded to multiple cloud vaults, each with different access keys and different failovers. He sent those keys to Maria and Lena separately, so no single compromise could collapse everything. Then he made a final step, a deadman note, not theatrical, not dramatic, just a simple instruction embedded into a timed message that would send if Ethan stopped checking in. It included a summary of what he'd found, where the mirrored files existed, and a list of names most likely to retaliate. He didn't want to use it, but wanting had never kept anyone alive. Shadow rose suddenly, ears snapping toward the front of the house. Ethan froze. He listened. A vehicle approached on the dirt road, not the clean glide of Hale's SUV, a cheaper engine, faster, a little too eager. Ethan moved to the window and peered out. A sheriff's cruiser. His stomach tightened. Either someone called the cops about the break-in, or the enemy had decided to show up wearing official colors. Shadow growled low. Ethan didn't tell him to stop. He just put a hand on the dog's back, grounding both of them. The cruiser stopped in the drive. A deputy stepped out, young, slim, hat on, posture stiff. He looked around like he expected to be ambushed by a ghost story. Ethan didn't open the door right away. He watched through the glass, reading body language like he'd been trained to. The deputy didn't move like the intruders. He didn't scan angles with confidence. He looked like a man following procedure. But procedure could still be weaponized. Ethan opened the door just enough to speak. "Can I help you?" The deputy's eyes flicked a shadow who stood behind Ethan, but visible enough to make a point. The deputy swallowed, then said, "Morning, sir. We got a call about disturbance out here, storm damage, possible break-in." Ethan didn't answer immediately. "Who called?" The deputy hesitated. "Anonymous, of course." Ethan kept his tone steady. "There was an attempted break-in." The deputy's gaze drifted past Ethan's shoulder, catching the splintered back door visible through the hallway. His expression shifted, unease, curiosity, then something else Ethan didn't like. A flicker of calculation. "You sure you're okay handling this yourself?" the deputy asked. Ethan held his gaze. "I'm fine." The deputy cleared his throat. "We'll need to file a report, take statements, maybe come inside and—" "No," Ethan said. The word landed like a door shutting. The deputy blinked. "Sir, if there's evidence—" Ethan's voice remained calm. "I said no." Shadow took a half step forward. The deputy's eyes widened slightly. Then he forced a professional smile. "All right. But you should know. Folks around here don't like trouble." Ethan almost laughed, but didn't. "Funny. Trouble found me." The deputy's smile tightened. He backed down the steps slowly, returned to his cruiser, and drove away. Ethan watched until the vehicle disappeared. Then he locked the door. He turned to Shadow. "Now we know," he murmured. "They can reach me through official channels, too." Shadow's ears flicked, like he was receiving that truth in his own language. Ethan's phone buzzed again. "Lena. Lena. I'm seeing a private security contractor name recurring. North Ridge Solutions. If that's their muscle, they may have local law enforcement cooperation. Also, these documents, if authentic, trigger federal jurisdiction quickly. Get copies to EPA Enforcement plus a major national desk. Maria may have contacts." Ethan's eyes narrowed. North Ridge Solutions. A corporate-sounding name that could hide anything. He forwarded the note to Maria. Then he looked toward the tree line. He didn't feel safe. But he felt ready. Because the truth was no longer trapped in one house. It was already moving. The enemy's best play now wasn't to retrieve, it was to intimidate, to scare Ethan into silence before the story gained too much momentum. But intimidation only worked if you could isolate someone. Ethan wasn't isolated anymore. Not with Maria, not with Lena, not with Lucas inbound, and not with Shadow, who had proven last night that loyalty wasn't just affection, it was protection. The phone buzzed again, news alerts this time. Ethan's thumb hovered over the screen, then tapped. A headline flashed. Leaked documents suggest massive Colorado environmental cover-up. Another, bribery allegations tie state inspectors to industrial contamination. Then, missing journalist case reopened after new evidence emerges. Ethan's breath caught. The story was already out, faster than he expected. He stared at the screen, feeling the weight shift in his chest. Not relief, not yet, but a change, a pivot. Because once the truth became public, the enemy's advantage began to collapse. Public attention was light. Light burned. A vehicle approached again. This time, Ethan recognized the sound before he saw it. Lucas's old truck. It came up the drive and stopped crooked, like Lucas had been too focused on speed to care about perfect parking. Lucas climbed out, hoodie under a jacket, hair damp from the lingering mist. He saw Ethan and raised a hand. "Captain says you're trying to become a headline." Ethan opened the door fully. Lucas stepped onto the porch and immediately noticed the splintered wood. His expression shifted from humor to seriousness. "Okay," Lucas said quietly. "So it's like that." Ethan nodded. "It's like that." Lucas looked down at Shadow, who studied him for a long moment before allowing a single tail twitch. Lucas swallowed. "Hey, Shadow. Good to see you, man." Shadow didn't move, but the tension in his shoulders eased a fraction. Lucas stepped inside, eyes scanning automatically. Maria's training, Ethan realized. The rookie was learning faster than Ethan gave him credit for. Lucas looked around the damage. "You did this with a dog?" Ethan corrected him. "Shadow did his job. I did mine." Lucas exhaled slowly. "Maria sent me with supplies, extra cameras, a new lock kit, and—" He lifted a small hard case. "Portable drive, if you want a physical backup." Ethan took it. "We're doing physical backups." Lucas nodded once. And, Lena told Maria to tell me to tell you. She wants originals moved off-site, like now. Ethan glanced toward the compartment. Agreed, Ethan said. Lucas hesitated. Where do you want me? Ethan didn't need to think. Front window, he said. Eyes on the drive. If anything approaches, we don't wait to be surprised. Lucas moved immediately, seriousness settling into him like a uniform. Ethan returned to the bookshelf and pulled out the remaining physical folders, organizing them into a weatherproof bag. He didn't take everything. He left the compartment looking normal. Empty shelves, normal books, normal house. But the core evidence, the journal, those left with him. He was sealing the truth away from fire. He was treating paper like it mattered, because it did. Maria called again. Ethan answered and put her on speaker so Lucas could hear. Maria didn't waste time. It's breaking. National desks are biting. Federal contacts are sniffing. Ethan, listen. If they move to arrest, your danger increases before it decreases. Desperate people do desperate things. Ethan looked at Shadow, then at Lucas. I know, Ethan said. Maria's voice softened, just enough to show she was human. You did the right thing. Ethan didn't respond with gratitude. He responded with a fact. We're moving originals off-site. Good, Maria said. And Ethan? Yeah. Don't stay alone in that house tonight. Ethan's eyes drifted to the lake beyond the window, beautiful, cold, and now stained in his mind with what had almost happened. I won't, he said. By afternoon, the headlines multiplied like wildfire. Not just one story, a cascade, a network of reporters confirming, cross-checking, calling agencies that could no longer pretend they didn't see smoke. Lucas sat on the couch with his phone in his hand, eyes wide as he scrolled. Dude, he said, voice low, they're naming people. Ethan leaned over and saw it. County-level inspectors, a state environmental director, contract links, a private security contractor referenced by name. Then another update. EPA enforcement reviewing newly released documents in Colorado tagged another. Arrest warrant sought for a businessman, Richard Hale, in obstruction inquiry. Ethan stared. Hale. The polished smile, the velvet threat, now reduced to a name on a screen, exposed to a system bigger than his influence, at least for the moment. Ethan didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He just felt something loosen inside him, like a knot slowly untying. Because for the first time since he'd stepped into this house, the direction of danger had shifted. The enemy wasn't hunting him alone anymore. The enemy was being hunted by sunlight. Lucas looked up. So, what now? Ethan glanced at Shadow. The dog had finally laid down near the window, head on his paws, still alert but not coiled. That was Shadow's way of saying, the immediate threat is gone, not forever, but for now. Ethan answered Lucas quietly. Now we breathe. Lucas blinked. That's it? Ethan shook his head. No, now we stay smart. We keep backups. We keep check-ins. We don't assume the worst is done just because the headlines are loud. Lucas nodded slowly, absorbing it. Ethan walked to the deck with Shadow at his side. The lake shimmered under pale sunlight. Wind moved across the surface in gentle patterns. It looked peaceful again. But Ethan knew peace wasn't a view. It was a decision, a line you held. Shadow leaned against his leg, heavy warmth through fur and muscle. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's back. This was supposed to be a quiet place, Ethan murmured. Shadow didn't respond like a human, but he shifted closer, pressing weight into Ethan in silent agreement. The house behind them was still bruised, splintered wood, scattered reminders. But it stood. And so did Ethan. Not because he was invincible, because he refused to step away when someone else's suffering tried to hide itself behind fear. He turned back toward the door. Lucas was inside, installing the new lock kit with focused attention. Not joking now, not careless, growing. Ethan realized something then. This wasn't just a case that got reopened. It was a turning point. Not for the town, for him. He hadn't found healing by running from darkness. He'd found it by facing it, without losing himself to it. And Shadow had been the first to tell him where to look. Ethan took one last breath of cold lake air. Then he stepped inside. The house was his. But more than that, the truth was no longer trapped here.